Hello, and welcome to a fresh episode of Global Tantrum. I am your host, Steve Pally. With me, as always, is my co host, Professor Galen Jackson. Once again, this is the show where multiple political scientists try to explain the post war international order first to ourselves and then hopefully to you. Galen, how are you? You've changed locations.
Doing good, man. Visiting family for a bit. Got a bunch
Excellent.
of kids running around, so I know your world a little more intimately than I used to.
Yes. So I was born in the darkness and you merely adopted it, my friend. My understanding is you have 7 children under the age of 7 in your immediate vicinity right now. I wish you the very best of luck with that.
Well, there's lots of adults too, so we're able, I'm picking up the lingo from everyone. We're able to play man to man.
Okay.
You know, there is a pool nearby, which complicates matters, but
One could also say that it simplifies matters because it wears children out, gets them to sleep at night. A voice of experience here. But we are not here to talk about family. We're here to talk about an article you published recently. And as a professor of political science, this is something that academics do. They publish work. So I thought it'd be interesting to dive into how that process works and how it's changing. A little bit away from our usual wheelhouse, I guess. But we'll get to the substance of the paper too. So maybe first you could just describe what it is that you published and where. We'll take it from there.
sure. I wrote a paper about at this point, I think, pretty clear pattern of failed regime change operations, specifically in the Middle East.
Yep.
So obviously, the motivating case is the one we've been talking about quite a bit for the past 5 months, which is the ongoing war in Iran, which appears to potentially be entering a new and dangerous phase as diplomacy falters. And we had talked about it a lot on the show, and I was just curious thinking about this, or puzzled maybe is a little bit better word for it. You and I are, of the age when the Iraq War, September 11th, are kind of the defining moments of, when we were younger, college
Yeah.
age, sort of thing. And obviously, the question of whether the United States and or Israel would attack Iran has been looming in the background for about 20 years now. And there were the counterproliferation strikes of last summer, which we talked about. That's one thing, although I thought that was a dangerous escalation that might lead to where we got today anyway. But doing a full regime change operation in the Middle East, I just kind of had a hard time wrapping my head around the fact that the United States would do that, because, to butcher a Fight Club analogy, the first rule of regime change in the Middle East is don't try to do regime change in the Middle East. It does not have a good track record. So
Mhm.
my paper basically covered 5 cases. Could have added a few more too, by the way. Saddam Hussein attacks Iran in 1980, starting the Iran-Iraq War. There's a number of motivations driving him to do that, but one of them is the idea maybe he can topple the revolutionary regime. But I thought the 5 clearest cases of this were the 1956 Suez Crisis, where Britain, France, and Israel jointly tried to overthrow the regime of Gamal Abdel Nasser after he nationalized the Suez Canal. The Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, where the Israelis tried to boot the PLO out of Lebanon, boot the Syrians out of Lebanon, and install a Israeli-friendly Maronite Christian government there. The third case was the U.S. efforts to dethrone Saddam Hussein after he invaded Kuwait in 1990. That spans 3 different administrations in the United States, culminating, of course, with the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2000. Operation Odyssey Dawn, which was the Obama administration's what started as a humanitarian intervention in Libya in 2011 and then morphed into a regime change operation to remove Muammar Gaddafi. And then, really, the start of all of this, which brings us kind of full circle, the 1953 US British sponsored coup in Iran that brought Shah to power, which 25 years later ends with the Iranian Revolution, which sets the stage for where we are today. And, the takeaway I basically had was these operations almost always fail because they muster a number of forces or create a number of unintended consequences that are really difficult for an outside power to wrap their arms around. You typically get a rally around the flag nationalist response. You get extremism, right? The Iraq War, you saw jihadist violence against US troops. Other states in the area moved to exploit the situation, as the Iranians did in that case. There tends to be a fundamental disjuncture between political and military objectives, kind of the central point of strategies. Those things have to be linked together, and military force does not always mean you can achieve basic political outcomes. And so these operations tend not to work. And my takeaway there was like, we shouldn't be surprised that, as you and I have discussed, the current war isn't going very well. Uh, and rather than go back to military action, which seems, I'm not totally sure we're going to see, a full scale bombing campaign as we did back in February, March, and early April. But it's possible, and I think that would be a mistake. And really, what needs to happen is to focus narrowly on the nuclear question and try to reach some sort of agreement similar to, maybe perhaps marginally better than, the 2015 nuclear agreement with the Iranians, and abjure the goal of regime change. So that was, the basic gist of the article.
Got it. Thank you for laying that out. And I think we'll get back to that and ask some questions that
Sure.
probably came up during the writing of that. Where did you publish this thing?
Oh yeah, totally forgot. I published it at one of my favorite outlets, which is a place called War on the Rocks. Now, I suppose I'm biased since they've published me a few times at this point. And in the interest of full disclosure, I used to be an associate editor at a journal called the Texas National Security Review, which has a certain relationship with them. War on the Rocks preceded TNSR. I don't remember by how long, but it's been around for, I think, something like 15 years.
Is War on the Rocks associated with UT Austin?
I don't think so.
Okay.
TNSR is, and maybe there's a linkage due to that,
Okay.
but I'd have to check. Another thing I really like about War on the Rocks, I think their editorial process, when you're publishing, it can be, there are hoops you have to jump through, and no one necessarily likes doing that, but they're doing it because they want to make the paper better. And I think they're top notch at that, frankly, having gone through the process with them multiple times. But above all, they are doing really, I think this gets to the heart of your question. They do important work in the sense that they are interested in public engagement and working on policy issues. And they're not the only shop that does that, but I think they do it in a really solid way. And they do it in a way that you can cover important pieces of different aspects of security studies. I think they're phenomenal at military affairs, and they get people who are formerly in the military, they get ex-policymakers, they publish academics and commentary. And they're a venue that I think policymakers and academics are both very interested in. And from my vantage point, I actually don't think there's that many places that are able to get that balance. So
It's pretty rare. Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
When we were coming up in graduate school, and then when you were going for tenure, like the gold standard was these like very specific academic journals that published super high quality research that, like could change the entire discipline or create new theories, like incredibly influential stuff for academics, but not necessarily for policymakers, and certainly not for the public at large.
Yeah.
And like this gets to the fundamental tension of, academia as a discipline. It's like we're supposed to research and advance the state of knowledge and understanding about the world, but we're also supposed to disseminate it. And like the incentives like aren't necessarily set up the best for that. So the fact that we have these kind of like hybrid venues, these publications that are more accessible and reaching a larger audience, I think is like a really, really good thing.
I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah.
I think War on the Rocks does it particularly well. And I think what they're looking to do, and there's other places that have tried to do this over the years with varying degrees of success, like Washington Post Monkey Cage used to be a place that did
Right.
this. What they're looking for is people with expertise in their field, frequently academics, who can try to speak in a way to a larger audience. And to me, that's really cool because anyone that's done a PhD in a grad school program or written a peer-reviewed article, and as you were just alluding to, that's important stuff,
Yeah.
and you can learn an awful lot from it, but sort of knows like you're writing for a fairly narrow audience. And it's sometimes unsatisfying to do all of this work, right? Like publishing a peer-reviewed piece, I can tell you, is like an enormous amount of legwork.
It's usually at least a year, if not more.
Well, depending on when you start the clock, right? If you're
Yeah.
starting, in my case, from the time I enter an archive to like when you see the final product, that number could be 2 or 3 years.
Easily. Yeah.
Yeah. And these hybrid outlets, they're shorter pieces. I think mine was like just over 3,000 words.
Hmm.
And, most people don't have time to go read a 20,000 word peer reviewed dense article.
Well, they probably don't have access to these journals.
100% also a good point.
They're really expensive, right? Like they've been, yeah, it's cloistered. It's cloistered access. And that is why, it's usually limited to institutions and other academics. It's like subscriptions to these journals can be like crazy expensive. Yeah.
By the way, same thing for depending on what book you're talking about, right? Like some books written for academic audiences are the most expensive ones.
Yep.
And really they're mainly housed in university libraries unless you want to pay like a staggering sum on Amazon for them. But I do think like what you're sort of hinting at a little, like it seems to be changing. And I increasingly feel I don't get to say this a lot, so it's kind of nice. I think that's a really good thing. I think it's good for all parties in the sense that if the goal of what we're doing in theory, right, I have respect for the person's privacy. I won't reveal, not that they would really care, but their identity. But I once heard someone make a point like, why do we do what we do? It tends to be like 3 reasons. It's really cool to work on things that are like on the front pages of newspapers, right? That's just like a cool thing to be able to do. 2, the issues are fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Just an intellectual feast. And 3, you're hoping to leave the world a little bit better of a place.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for many people, myself included, like, it depends on the day, but that third one tends to take priority. At least, that's in theory why I got into this stuff in the first place.
Yeah.
And if you're writing for really narrow audiences, you can really feel like that part is just falling out, or, you're not really hitting that goal. And to the extent you feel like you're engaging in a more public discussion, for me, that's extremely satisfying. And, I say that knowing tons of people will hate what I wrote and violently disagree, but like, that's kind of
that's the whole point.
That's the whole point of what we're doing.
Yeah. It's like, probably your article has a comments section, would be my guess. And yeah, maybe like some kind of debate will come up there.
Which I think at its best, I once heard someone say this, a prominent editor at a prominent journal said, you should think of academia at its best as having a conversation.
Yes. A long and occasionally contentious conversation. Yes.
But at its best, I think that's not a bad way to think about it.
Right.
And honestly, it's part of the reason I'm doing this with you, right? Like this is a better way to reach people. And again, there are probably lots of people who disagree with us all the time, and that's fine. But I also think, so that makes it better from my standpoint, but I think it's also good to have, there's this term, if it's academics and policy people bridging the gap.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also important to try to bridge the gap between the general public and people in academia. Like, I think it's useful for everyone to be able to engage in these conversations. I certainly learn a lot when I do it. It requires me to think about things in a different way. It requires me to write about things in a different way. I guess the key question going forward is how much are pieces in places like War on the Rocks or Foreign Affairs or what have you going to weigh in tenure decisions. And
Right.
that shift I don't think has happened yet, except at certain institutions. I still
Yeah.
think they're in the minority.
Yeah, and institutions tend to change pretty slowly. It's kind of like a process of generational change. And academia, I would say it's a conservative institution, not necessarily politically, but in the sense that the way that academia functions just doesn't change very fast over time. We're talking about literally a medieval institution that retained
Yeah.
pretty much like similar structure, over the course of the last, let's call it 800 years,
Yeah.
something like that. And modern research universities are much more recent, but we're still talking about like 150 plus years. And yeah, like you and I, when we got our doctorates, we dress up in like medieval getup. We have these capes and like
It's
crazy
weird,
hats.
man. I still think it's weird. It's like people are graduating. Let's dress like we're in Harry Potter. Like
Totally. It's pretty funny, is what it is. And then, yeah, we were there for like 6 hours or however long it took at UCLA. It took forever.
I actually
But
did not go to my hooding ceremony. I went backpacking.
okay, that was a much better choice. I'm glad we did it. But yeah, no, it's like, where are the incentives, right? And like, if you think about it, we are political scientists, and the science part of this is more important than the political part to me,
Yeah.
anyway. Science has never been purposeless. It has always contended with the real world. Like the first scientists were trying to change things in the real world. They're trying to figure out how the world works for a reason, to affect change, right? So yes, it's great to just produce knowledge, and it's important to do that, and it can be like super fulfilling. But like, if you and I are political scientists, we want to have an effect on
Yeah.
politics. You wrote a paper about how regime change doesn't work
In
in
the
in the Middle East. Yeah, and we'll get into that a little bit. But it's like, you want people who are making policy, you want citizens who vote in elections to read that stuff and be
yes.
like he makes some good points. I think I agree with that. And now when I vote, I'm going to vote for politicians that are less likely to do regime change in the Middle East. And by the way, a big central appeal of Donald Trump in the Republican Party when he was winning that first primary was no more operations in the Middle East. Right? He's gone on to break that promise, and it's hurt him politically somewhat. Remains to be seen how much, right? We've talked about that on this show. But it's like there's clearly fertile ground for this type of idea. You have the evidence to back it up. You've now put that evidence in a venue that actually reaches people outside of like very specific, like technical disciplinary journals.
I want to be clear, like I'm not, there are some major people, whether it's in the policy world or academic worlds, who are like eminent and, if they write something, people read it. I am not one of those people.
Sure. Your Paul Krugmans,
Who will
Tyler
have
Cohen's.
much more reach and much more influence on these discussions.
Yeah.
Like that bothers me a little bit less. Like, yes, it's probably great to be those people. But like, I think of this more as you're just trying to move the needle a little bit, or if nothing else, like elevate the level of discussion about these matters.
You're trying to contribute to the world that we live in,
Right.
and make it a better place.
And, I'm under no illusions, right, about like direct policy influence. So I, end the paper by calling for negotiations on a nuclear deal. I think they published that on Monday morning, and by the early afternoon, I was at the gym seeing news that the shooting had recommenced. So clearly,
Yeah.
like, that did not reach the White House. I was not
Not this time.
expecting it. I was not expecting it to.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, like to me, it's enormously important that these places exist. And I actually do think you are seeing more, not only receptiveness to academics doing this, but actually even a little bit more pushing from academic departments to do more public engagement. And I think that's a really good thing.
Yeah.
Now, I don't want this to get into a situation where everyone becomes, for lack of a better term, a public intellectual and just like has an idea in the morning and decides like, I'm going to write about it. I still think it's important that this stuff, as you said, that the science piece really does matter, be grounded in someone's experience and expertise, that's based on that previous peer-reviewed work. I think that's an important link.
I'm going to stop you right there and ask you if you're familiar with such media personalities as Joe Rogan,
Sure.
Tucker Carlson. It's like
Yes.
some of the most influential generators of opinion have no expertise whatsoever, unfortunately. And so I think it's good that academics are like actually engaging them to a
Yeah.
certain extent on the same ground. I think it's necessary at this
Yeah.
point in time, right?
100%. I also wanted to, you said something earlier that I think is really important. I don't want to push the point too far because some of, as you know, and anyone who has studied the philosophy of science literature knows, some of like the biggest breakthroughs in science have been from people doing, quote unquote, pure research rather than
Mm-hmm.
applied research, right? Like one of my favorite examples comes from one of my favorite books, which is The Making of the Atomic Bomb. And if you read that book, like, yes, there comes a point where there's an oh shit moment. I think the book starts with a guy named Leo Szilard
Yes.
recounting a story of he's standing at a crosswalk and he had just heard a talk by a guy named Ernest Rutherford who said the idea that you could split the atom and cause a chain reaction that would release a huge amount of energy was talking moonshine. Like we got to a point where your Fermis of the world, like actually fission to the atom. You see this right on the eve of World War II, where suddenly people say, oh, we need to be studying this, like with the purpose of seeing whether it's possible to build a super bomb. But if you go back just a few decades, like they're kind of just like messing around in the lab.
Or
Like,
not even in the lab. They're messing around on the whiteboard. I mean, the
yeah,
key foundational research for nuclear power and nuclear weapons was Einstein's theories of relativity, which are as pure research as pure research can get. Nobody understood any applications for that stuff at the time.
or sometimes this stuff happens by pure accident. That same guy I mentioned, Ernest Rutherford, who I think is one of the smartest and most fascinating people I've ever studied, right? Like the way the nucleus was discovered is they're just shooting alpha particles.
At a gold foil. Right?
Yes. And like suddenly one of them bounces back. And he's like,
Yeah,
that's weird. That's as if I shot a bullet at a piece of paper and it bounced back at my head.
it really
And
shouldn't happen.
that's how they were like, huh, there must be a mass in there. Anyway, like,
Yeah.
so I don't want to push this point too far because like sometimes pure research gets you to pretty incredible places. But at a moment when I think academia is about as unpopular as it's ever been in the United States,
Yeah. No joke.
I, yeah, I do think it's important for us to be engaging with people in a way where they actually say, okay, I get the tangible value of what these people are doing and why there are grants for people doing this research and like why we should be sending students to these places to learn, right? Like I do think it helps to have that a little bit more of a direct link between, hey, I'm like, working on my stuff about the Egypt-Israel peace treaty in the 70s and like what does that mean for us today when we're at war
It
with
means a lot.
yeah.
Yeah. I think it's really important. And like, again, you just made the point. It's like academia. We're in a populist moment where expertise, generally speaking, is unpopular. We have like a exponential just multiplication of opinion available to us and gigantic echo chambers. And it's all, because of technology and things like that. The answer to that for expertise is not to turn away.
Yeah.
It is to turn towards. And it
Yes.
is to engage, in my opinion. Like using the tools that the populists are using to get the results that they're getting. I think that's what we need right now. So it's cool to see you publish this paper,
I'd make one other point, which just occurred to me that I think is important. This is one of those things, like, I want to be a little careful in how I choose my words, but I'm like largely conceding the point. Like, there's a perception that academia tends to be dominated by people of a more liberal mindset. I think that can be overstated, but I think that perception exists for a reason, which is like there's a lot of truth in it.
Yes.
Not everywhere, right? There are certain schools where that's not the case, but I tend to think that that is true. And there's some data to back this up that's pretty strong that that perception exists because there is a real slant in academia. Okay. These outlets we're talking about, they're nonpartisan. And If you have ideas that you can articulate in an intelligent way and they think they are important and contribute to the debate, they'll publish you.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important as well.
Yeah. I'm an empiricist. It's like there's political preference and then there's reality.
Yeah.
And I'm somebody who, like you and I have done quite a bit of training, arguably too much training, to be able to evaluate the internal and external validity of an argument somebody makes against the available evidence. There can be problems with the evidence, there can be problems with the argument. You can have both at once, and it's very frequent, right? But if somebody presents to me data, with a internally and externally valid argument that actually connects to the data, it's like, I'm probably going to change my mind.
Totally.
And
this is not my thought. This is from someone we both used to study with. What a beautiful thing it is to change your mind.
Yes. Yeah.
And like, it sometimes is viewed as a weakness. It really should not be. And like, look, you've got to take some risks doing this, right? Like, I don't think this is going to happen, but if I wake up tomorrow and read the New York Times, like Iran surrenders, like new American friendly government in charge in Tehran, I'll be like, wow, that article I just wrote was not well timed.
I feel like that would be in like the classic 128 point font at the end of World War II.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
That would be great. Yeah. It seems unlikely,
You have to be willing to be wrong, but like
Yes.
that is what we're doing, right? Like
Yeah.
you have ideas and you want to have a discussion about whether they're right or wrong.
Yeah, totally. So we have a little bit of time left, a little bit of a shorter episode this week. You got into what the article is about a little bit earlier. I'd like to actually return to the article. We will post a link to the article in the show notes so everybody can check it out if you're interested and reach your own conclusions about it. And yes, like Galen, we are tooting your horn here for you. That's totally fine. And that's everybody's building a personal brand. It's the year 2026. So that's what we're going to do. And whether or not you recognize it's what we've been doing for the past year and a half on this show. But anyway, so I read the article. I thought it was good. You used the 5 cases from the Middle East. Immediately, my mind went outside of the Middle East.
Yeah.
And thought about 2 other cases we've talked about on this show in Latin America. And it's like, okay, this has not worked in the Middle East. It seems to have worked somewhat better elsewhere. The cases being Panama in, was it 86?
89.
89.
Yeah.
Okay, that was Noriega. And then very recently, Maduro in Venezuela, which we covered on this show.
Guatemala, 54. Yeah, you can name a few other, but they tend to be in the Western Hemisphere. I'm sure we're maybe forgetting a few.
Yeah,
one that didn't work, by the way, South Vietnam, 1963, but that's another story.
So that's interesting, right? Is that a case of regime? You're talking about Diem?
Yeah, no, I mean, so this is actually, I got comments on this on the paper from people is like, what is actually meant by regime change, right?
Yeah,
like,
right.
When one speaks of a regime, you tend to speak about a whole order of things or, a set of institutions or a way of being rather than just a leader. So, yeah.
And the more successful cases that we're talking about, successful, right? We don't know how successful Venezuela is or successful relative to what, right?
As of now, it seems to be working, but like we're early in the story.
That's right. It's like, well, these are in the Western Hemisphere. It's closer, right? These are smaller, in some cases, weaker countries in some cases, I guess, less complicated neighborhoods to a certain extent. Fewer neighbors that are intent on making trouble once a regime collapses.
As someone that knows way less about such a weird thing, by the way, that Americans tend to know like a lot less about their neighborhood.
Yeah, I know.
But you won't get any argument with me saying that the politics of the Middle East are, among the most complicated in the world. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, certainly really complicated. And like regime change is not a new idea, but in the modern era, right? Which I personally date from like the end of World War II. I feel like the tone was very much set for this style of operation by the regime changes in Japan and Germany in that war.
Yes.
And, so it's like that's like the mental frame through which like all these other operations have gone through. It's like these are the canonical super successful examples. I remember in the lead up to 2003 in
Yep.
I was arguing with people in my college fraternity, conservatives, who were like, we're going to do what we did to Germany and Japan. We're going to go in there and make it like the world's best country. No. And that was the argument. It's like, we're going to hark back and we're going to like spend whatever we're going to inflict total defeat on Saddam Hussein, have war crimes trials,
Yeah.
debathify the government, and basically hang out there until we're confident that we're good.
Now, like a few things, and judging from the standpoint of July 2026, I think you won those arguments decisively.
I talked to a few of those friends at this point, like 15 years ago, and at that point in time, they were ready to be like, okay, yeah, I was young and stupid.
Well,
I was like, I was also young and stupid, but I was right.
Yeah, right. No, I mean, without getting bogged down in the details of that a
So
bit,
to speak.
like, yeah, I think it relates to this discussion we're having. Yeah, Germany and Japan, first of all, far wealthier countries, with far more unified, homogenous, whatever you want to say, societies and populations.
These were highly functional states to begin with.
Iraq, no history of democracy in the modern period, a highly fractured society under personalist rule, no real middle class at that point. There actually was one back in, the 70s, but the combination of 25 years of war and sanctions and awful rule under Saddam Hussein decimated those. So like those were some of the arguments in advance. And you couple that with what many people, and myself included, see as a largely incompetent mode of occupying the country and not sealing the borders,
Right.
You look at the troop numbers in Germany and Japan as an island. We're talking about far more intrusive occupations, but it gets at this question of, you're sort of asking why has regime change arguably succeeded in some cases and not in others? Now, success we should define, right? Like it has also led to serious embitterment in some places.
Absolutely. Yeah. And what does count as success in this context? We get a different government that does what the United States wants or closer to it.
Well, and then like, how long does it have to work for, right?
Exactly.
Like, one point the editors of War on the Rocks made, which was a fair point to make, and
Iran was actually a success.
You could argue 1953 worked because the Shah was in charge for 25 years. And
Totally.
There are many Iranians who would rather live in the Iran of 1975 than in the Iran of 2026.
Mm-hmm.
So you could say like it worked until it didn't, but when it didn't, it really didn't. Yeah, like is having a puppet regime success? Like there are obviously moral issues at play that you could speak of. But your question actually helps in some ways. My puzzle was like, why does the United States keep doing this?
Yeah.
Or not just the Middle East, or sorry, not just the United States, Britain, France, Israel, but yeah.
Yeah, as regards that puzzle, there are clear reasons to try to get away with it because it's so cheap. If you can like figure out how to do it and just hope that it works.
Like Iraq was not cheap at all, right?
True, it wasn't, but like the idea was going in. This was dumb and wrong, but the theory was we will be in there. They will welcome us as liberators.
Yes,
there's not going to be like literally instantaneous insurgency that just goes on forever, right? It's like, no, like we're going to get buy-in and we'll set things up and we'll do the Douglas MacArthur white shogun in Japan thing for 4 years.
The Constitution, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Here's your Constitution. All right, we're good. You guys are allies now. We're out, That was the theory.
And by the way, like I got first interested in this back, we both spent time at the University of Chicago, and I took a class on the Arab-Israeli conflict there and wrote a paper on the 1982 Israel-Lebanon case. And the reason I was interested in it is I'm sitting there reading about this guy, Ariel Sharon, at the time
Hmm.
defense minister, later the prime minister. And I'm reading about this plan he has. I'm like, this guy is out of his mind.
In the
Uh,
early 80s
yes. I mean, this
in
was like
Lebanon.
2010 that I'm writing this paper. And having just looked at Iraq, I'm like, what is he thinking? Right? He's like, here's what we're going to do. We're going to get rid of the PLO, kick the Syrians out, install a friendly government. And then the Palestinians will flee to Jordan. They'll overthrow King Hussein and accept Jordan as their Palestinian state. And then we'll have peace treaties with Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. I'm like, this is lunacy. Like, there should have been no way anyone possibly could have thought this would work.
That, for those listening, was my head exploding. I did it on video, but
And it's like, I take what you're saying, and I very much think what you just said is what Trump and Netanyahu believed before they started this current war.
Mhm.
But we now have all of these failed cases. But I think what you're saying, and many people noted, us included, like the Maduro operation happened 2 months before Epic Fury. That clearly was on his mind. And Trump even said like that would be the perfect scenario or something to that effect.
it would be the perfect scenario. It's
And
just
so like,
not comparable.
right, well, so this is what resolves it, right? Like
Yeah.
sometimes it works in very narrow circumstances, even if it's highly risky. And maybe someone has a paper on like when it works and when it doesn't. And maybe the Middle East is just a critical factor here, right? That's
One thing we've noticed about Trump is as time has gone on between his administrations, it's like he's been rolling the dice more and more. He's gotten a lot more risk acceptant, right? And so if you are more risk acceptant, and even if then you acknowledge that the chances are not good of something working, it's like, okay, like there's the chances are not good. I'm going to go for it anyway, because if I get a jackpot, like this will be awesome, you know?
yeah.
And you can have your own personal calculation about how that's likely to play out. And his was probably, if it doesn't go awesome, then we'll just do negotiations and it'll be fine, you know?
Yeah.
Except it wasn't. Oh, and another key part of this was the people talking to him thought it very unlikely that Iran would close the Strait of Hormuz.
Well, as we discussed, like everyone thought they would do that for the past 20 years.
Yes, but they were like, it would damage their own economy too much. Apparently, in the reporting, this has been reported. I don't know who he was talking to, but that was the information that it got.
I'm now struck by, because another case we forgot to mention is Allende in Chile in
Chile.
1973, replaced by Augusto Pinochet, a right-wing dictator.
Was that? Yeah, that was us. We did do that. That was Nixon.
Yes.
Yeah.
CIA, yes.
Okay.
And it's like, I don't know, we could again debate whether that was successful, but like, it's not new. We've talked about it. The US throws its weight around in the Western Hemisphere going back centuries, but it seems to do so, depending on how you define success, more effectively.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in that puzzle. Is it just a power projection is easier?
It's also far away.
Right. Yeah,
it's really far away.
That's a good point.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Yeah, it's we've been neighbors with Latin America basically since inception. Maybe that has something to do with it. I don't know. That's a really interesting sort of
or maybe it's just
case.
the Middle East. And I made very clear to put in my title, in the Middle East. That's how I was scoping it. But I don't have a great explanation for that regional divergence.
Well, so look, this has happened in Africa too.
Totally.
And that usually not always, actually. Sometimes you have dictatorships that last decades, like Congo, for instance, right?
Yeah. Now, again, you have to decide whether that's a success, right?
Right.
Like, people are interested, it's an old book on it, but if you're like interested in getting started on this topic, Stephen Kinzer, Overthrow, and like you read about how awful things get in a lot of these places. And like, as an American, I don't want to be associated with it.
I don't either. But as a scientist, what I would say about that is you should judge against whatever the people doing it wanted to happen. at the
Yeah.
time. If you're looking at like documentary evidence and things like that. And maybe the key part of the key is like state establishment. How strong of a state do you have to begin with? You know, these Latin American countries have been independent in most cases much longer than Middle Eastern countries. They are typically more ethnically homogenous. They have had, in many cases, at least periods of democracy or like mixed governance, anocracy.
So that's interesting, and actually, that sounds like the most plausible explanation we've laid out, because the
Yeah.
Middle East case I look at, right, like before Libya happens, Hillary Clinton, who was Secretary of State at the time, said something like, "Yeah, this is going to be hard to do since the guy we're taking out spent the last 4 decades destroying every institution the country has."
Same with Saddam, right?
Same with Saddam, Lebanon. We talked about how, like last month, on how fractured that country is. The Iran case is like, yes, there are institutions, but the Shah is basically a top-down autocrat in a country with a strong conservative bent that is demanding popular government. So maybe that one is a bit outside of what we're talking about. But yeah, like notoriously difficult to do this in places with lack of state capacity, lack of national cohesion,
Yeah.
lack of institutions.
It's interesting, right? Like Iran has been a state for thousands of years in one form or another. It's like to a certain extent, like a consolidated ethno state, but it also has very large ethnic minorities and restive ones too, outside of like ethnic Persians. So that probably has not made things any easier. Anyway, y'all should read Galen's paper. We will link
Thanks,
to
man.
it, yeah, in the comments. And yeah, fun discussion today. A little bit like behind the curtain of
Yeah, I enjoyed
academia.
doing it.
Yeah, and how it works. We're going to sign off for now. Till next time, this has been another episode of Global Tantrum.